And then I do a gravy. The gravy is usually vegetarian.
Vegetarian gravy is easy.
Okay. Hi everyone. Sorry, there's a lot of technology going on here. We have a couple of students that couldn't come tonight, or three, I think. So we're going to record the class. The camera's not pointed at you, but it might capture what you're saying. So this is a massive class. I can't believe you all want to become Jewish. So let's begin as we did last time, and I know we have some new students with our nigun. Lai, 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 lai. Lai, 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 lai. Lai, 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 lai. Lai, 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 lai. Lai, 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 lai. Lai, 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 lai. 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 Lai, 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 lai. La 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 la. La 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 la. It's good to be back with you. Very good. So last week we were discussing Sukkot. We watched that clip from Ushpuzim, the film. We talked about Etragim. We talked about the concept of Hidur HaMitzvah, that when something is commanded, in order to fully fulfill the commandment, we do it to its fullest extent. It's a value, I know, that not only exists in Torah, but one, as we mentioned, I think, last week, that exists in our lives as well. Some people call it a work ethic. Some people call it having high standards. Have you found, or did you find in this past week, thinking about that concept of Hidur HaMitzvah in your own life beyond the classroom and the course of study? Did you think about the intricacies of Sukkot, how God is in the details in any of the work that you do in your daily life and paying attention to details? And if so, can anybody share a reflection or a connection to that? Or was I the only one that was thinking that? Because that's what I'm feeling right now. It's vulnerable, but that's okay. It's fine, just leave me dangling out. One of the goals that we have for this class, I'm letting you have time to think and build up the courage to comment. One of the goals for this class is that you see the world through, I would say, Jewish lenses, Jewish eyes. That what we study in here serves a frame of reference for what you do out there. One of the amazing things, if you've been in Israel, when you go to Israel, if you read Israeli newspapers, which are not necessarily easy to read, by the way, the Hebrew, they will often have in the headlines references to the Torah portion of the week, or well-known biblical stories, things you would never get away with in the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, whatever it is, because it's part of the culture. It's part of the narrative of the Jewish people. And so you can make a reference to, it's raining like in the times of Noah. And that doesn't seem odd in an Israeli newspaper. And it's through that lens that we see this sort of seamless connection between the Jewish narrative and the Jewish lived experience. And we're trying to get to that connection also, so that it's not that you come to synagogue to be Jewish. You'll hear me say many, many times, it's not how often you show up in synagogue, it's how often synagogue shows up in your life. So that what we study here is not just in an academic sense, even though it was about a holiday that won't come again for another year and we had already missed it, but shows up in your life. So now, having given you time, have you made a connection between what we studied last week and anything that you did in the week since? Okay, so next week I'd like you to think about those things. Anybody?
Not directed to Sukkot, but like for the Shabbat, I just actually received my first kiddush and a challah cover and challah board.
Right.
So just kind of felt really excited. Just can't wait to put it
right
on a table, because I use it just a regular cup.
Mm-hmm.
So found it.
Right, so ritual objects, it's interesting. We were just studying this with our bar mitzvah students. We were talking about the talit, the prayer shawl they get. And we were talking about what's a ritual and what's a ritual object. And we all have rituals that we go through in our lives, but sometimes those rituals are connected to an object. If we're really into yoga, our ritual object might be our yoga mat, right? Or our ball of water, or whatever it is. And without that object, or with that object, we can make that time more sacred, more special. I know for me, when I work out, I have wireless headphones, and that's sort of a ritual object for me. And today I forgot them, and it was a harder workout because I wasn't sort of plugged into my thing. So when we're using a special cup as opposed to an everyday glass, that elevates it. And in order for something to be holy, it has to be separated and elevated, like we talked about. So having a ritual object helps us separate from the ordinary, and helps us connect with that ritual, so that we can, just like the nigun, so that we can kind of turn the channel to that right away, as opposed to having to sort of take the extra steps that it takes to transpose that ordinary glass into a sacred glass. You were going to add something?
It's not necessarily directly related to Sukkot, but
Right.
because, as you know, my father's quite ill, so I've been trying to, again, make that time for him, and kind of, I've set aside certain parts of my pretty busy life right now to have that time for my dad,
Right.
as well as, synagogue and everything else. And I think that delineation of time is also really important, because it's, that's a time that I have with my dad. I basically turn my phone off, like we play video games together.
You play video games with your dad?
Oh, my dad plays more video games than I do. So I'll go online and I'll play, because he lives in the Okanagan, so I'll play video games with him online. And I turn my phone off.
Are you playing Fortnite with your dad?
I play Destiny 2
Okay,
with my
just
father.
checking. My son played Fortnite with me this week. I'm like, I could see where I would spend a lot of hours on this. When I was at university, it was SimCity, and it used to come out right before finals, and I would just be buried in SimCity.
I think he
Anyway.
still plays that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But exactly that. So we want to create Zman Kodesh, holy time. And that time is different than other time. In order to do that, like I was saying, we have to separate and elevate. So if one of the core teachings of Judaism is that not all time is the same. So that as we follow Jewish times and seasons, and as we're looking at holidays now, there are moments that are commanded, that are dictated to us to be different in time, and that then require of us, a different mode, a different lens, a different way of being in the world than everybody else at that time. When we start to talk about, Passover or Kashrut, sometimes that can be, I'm using the word time now multiple times in a sentence, sometimes that can be very jarring. It can give this sense of being the other. And otherness is something that Jews both fear and they embrace at the same time. There's this concept of being an Am Segula, a unique and distinct people. So we celebrate that otherness, and at the same time our otherness has often been the thing that has been, the precursor to whatever the pogrom or the anti-Semitic act was, because they are other and therefore they can be treated this way. So we have this tension with otherness. But this otherness of time, for Shabbat example, those of you that are here on Saturday morning are not doing whatever it is your cohort, your circle of friends are doing on Saturday mornings. They're probably not in their own houses of worship, even on their entire weekends. I mean, how many of you have religious friends in other religions that you do? Wow, that's
I
really
wouldn't say
interesting.
many,
No.
but those who are faithful in it, they do have a very set, like, it's infused in all of their life.
Right.
They are Christian, but it's.
So are they church attendees? Are they churchgoers, or are they spiritual?
No, they attend church. I mean, it's one particular couple, and I've known her since high school, and so it's been really sort of lovely to see this continuation. Like she grew up, I actually saw her baptized, and sort of watching her have her own family. So they always say a prayer before every meal. It doesn't matter where they are,
Right.
in a busy restaurant, whatever. And so their life is, there's always that. It's just infused in their life. Yeah, which is interesting to witness. She's really the only one
Right.
in my life that has that.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, studies show of the millennial set, of which I am loosely grouping all of you in, 72% are none of the above. 72% of millennials are not at all interested in organized religion, while 72% of millennials, or roughly that, are spiritual, but they're not interested in organized religion. So that you each have friends that are doing somewhat of what you're doing now or on the weekends that would be fascinating to study that and
What
how
about
it is that you
generation?
kind of find each other.
What about Generation X? Does that change?
Generation X, sorry, what was that? What?
Millennials might just have a lot of friends.
Yeah, they might just have a lot of friends. I'm not sure what Generation X, that would be me. So.
And
At the
Um,
same
Probably
rate,
some of
though,
us
I mean,
here.
I go to yoga class every weekend, if not twice a weekend, and there's like 100 people in that room who are sitting in silence praying,
Right.
essentially,
Right.
sitting in meditation for 10 minutes, and they make it a practice.
Right, so that's a practice. I would define that as spirituality, not religion. A shorthand definition of that is that spirituality is religion on your terms, religion is spirituality on God's terms. Whereas, so it's commanded to you, this is how you have to believe and practice, whereas in religion, whereas in spirituality, you can pick and choose. And one of the interesting things about progressive Judaism, Reform Judaism, that there is some degree of picking and choosing within rather broad parameters of what is sort of acceptable religious practice. Anyhow, we're sort of off topic a little bit, but I wanted to touch on last week so that we could come to this week. The topic for this week is actually quite brief, but we're going to go a little deeper into the sort of related or tangential topic of Torah itself. But the topic for today's class is Simchat Torah. How many of you were here for the Simchat Torah service? A few. Yeah, Ed was. You were. No, you were reading that night. It was another day. So, tell us what you saw. Tell them what you saw. What did you see? Those that were here, what were we doing?
Well, first, the two Torahs were rolled, one from the beginning and round one to the end. And the reading, actually, there was the end of the annual cycles of reading Torah, and would automatically begin the new cycles of the new year without actually stopping or in the same breath.
Right.
And the second thing was circling with the Torah around the sanctuary.
Right.
The welcoming of new students. Or
Very good.
Yeah.
That's probably more than I remember from that evening. Anybody want to add to that? Anything else? Yeah.
Like a lot of attention on the children and
Right.
giving the children instruments or stuffed Torahs, which we do every Shabbat as well, and they got to circle 7 times, and before everything, of course, was dinner.
Right. Always food. Always food. And candy afterwards, which parents, including myself, don't like, but it was a tradition that was here before I got here. So, used to be more candy. I've reduced it a bit. So we celebrate the annual cycle of reading of Torah. Things that I think you already know, but I feel like I have to touch on anyways. So the Torah is broken into 54 different portions. By Torah here we mean the 5 books of Moses, sometimes referred to as the Chumash. And that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, or by their Hebrew names, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. Where do the English names and the Hebrew names come from? Completely different places. The English names are thematic. Genesis is the Genesis of the people. Exodus is Exodus. We could go on through. And the Hebrew names come from the first distinct or unique word, not necessarily always the very first word, but the first distinct or unique word in each Torah, in each book of the Torah. And then related to that, if we think of Torah as, if we think of each book of Torah as a pizza, that pizza itself has a number of slices. Each slice of that or portion of that has its own name, which doesn't have an English name. Though sometimes when we open up the Chumash, we see a thematic name. It might say the wandering or the giving of Torah or something like that. But the Hebrew name, again, comes from the first distinct word in that section or that slice of Torah. So there's 54 different portions of Torah broken into 5 different pizzas. And we eat that, if you would. We read those throughout the cycle of the year, and we follow a calendar that is linked to Jewish times and seasons. It's linked to the lunar calendar, so that we're reading Torah at the same time as the events are taking place in Torah, or the events are prescribed to take place in Torah. So as we're reading about things having to do with Yom Kippur, we're reading that story. We go back to that story for a special portion at that time. And that calendar is followed by all Jews around the world. So that in any synagogue, there are a couple of exceptions, but in general, in any synagogue around the world, everybody is reading the same portion. Everybody's eating the same slice of pizza that day. Which, well, what do you think the benefits are of that? What's the wisdom in having a system like that? Yeah.
It's like a sense of community, but like worldwide,
Mhm.
still connected.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it can also help create it has created a continuity that's persisted over diaspora, pogroms, everything that you mentioned before, and 5,000 years of history, and this has been the cycle and has continued to be so.
And it creates a measure of time also. It creates last week was Parshat Noah, the story of Noah, which is the anniversary of my Bar Mitzvah Torah portion. So you begin to start to see things in new cycles. And my mom sent me a text, and she does every year. Today is the anniversary of Bar Mitzvah portion. She used to say, get to synagogue. Now she assumes I'm there. Now she'll say, like, take a break, go away, whatever. But so we begin to start to see ourselves in relation to the story of the Torah. How far am I from when my Bar Mitzvah portion comes again? It's that time of year when we start reading about the sacrifices, or it's that time of year when, in fact, they do this now on Twitter, between Pesach and Shavuot, which holidays we haven't covered yet, but the story of the Exodus and the story of the giving of Torah, there's a period called the counting of the Omer, and we start to count the days in between, and they'll hashtag it out. Hashtag receiving Torah or something like that, hashtag Torah, so that you're starting to see yourself, in that same sequence of events. Certain Torah portions are coming up, and sometimes people will actually go to synagogue just because, we're going to read the Ten Commandments this week, or it's Noah, or whatever these well-known stories are. People want to come and hear them. So that adds another element to, again, we talk about sacred being something that's separated and elevated, a new way to count time. And that's really what Simchat Torah is about. Simchat Torah is a holiday that allows us to count time by the Jewish narrative, by the Jewish story. So if you have a book that you read every year over and over again, and the book never changes, we begin to count time by how we change in relation to that book. Okay, it's another year, and I'm hearing the story of the binding of Isaac, the near sacrifice of Abraham's son Isaac. How does that story relate to me differently now than it did last year? It's a common question Jews will ask because we read that story on Rosh Hashanah. In fact, Jews that only come once or twice a year think that's the only story we ever read from the Torah. They know it's not. Well, most of them know it's not. But I'll tell you that story changed for me when I became a father. Now I'm viewing it through the eyes of the child, or the father who would do such a thing to their child, or the mother who was left wondering what happened to her husband, and more poignantly, what happened to her son when she woke up and there was no note and he had taken the family car or donkey and headed off. And there were rumors that he had been hearing voices of God. So you can imagine. So we start to see ourselves in relation to how we have changed, though the story itself has remained the same. And then there are other things, there's questions that come up each year. So when we study, or when we read the passage about the receiving of Torah, a text we're going to look at today, we'll ask the question, well, Torah was given, 2,000-3,000 years ago, and they accepted it then, and they accepted it on our behalf, but if we receive Torah each year, if we ask ourselves, am I willing to receive or accept the responsibilities of living a Jewish life again? Can I renew in that? Now that's not a holiday, it's just a moment that comes up in the story, where we say again, okay, am I still in line with this? Is there an alignment here between my values and our narrative? So we talk about ourselves as being the people of the book, or others talk about us as being the people of the book, and this is the book that we talk about. The book that we talk about is Torah. So Simchat Torah celebrates that cycle that we start over again, and the marking of time. What I'd like to do with you is to look at some texts, because really that's all there is to Simchat Torah. There's a few rituals about walking around with the Torah. We already talked about the reading, but it's a simple holiday. But the meaning and the meaning of Torah behind it helps us understand why it's a holiday to begin with. So what I'd like to do is to look at some text with you. I apologize that, well, they're numbered. They're just not sequential for the most part. But I sort of pulled some things together. So let's look at this first one. It's on page number 3. And this is a midrash. Have we talked about midrash yet? Do you know what a midrash is? You heard the phrase? Term? Okay, so briefly, midrash, as was explained to me when I was a student, midrash is literature about literature. It's not a factual event. This is not a historical account. It is a folktale, trying to illuminate values, trying to illuminate character, trying to bring to life. Some people say midrash is what happens between the words, or between the letters, trying to bring to life the story. When I taught in the United States, I would always use this analogy. I'm not sure it works in Canada, but I haven't found a better one. If you ask any American elementary school student what they know about George Washington, they will tell you George Washington could not tell a lie. Because George Washington would say, his mother said, "Who cut down this cherry tree?" And George Washington would say, "I cannot tell a lie, it was I who cut down that cherry tree." And from that story about George Washington cutting down a cherry tree at Mount Vernon and his mother finding out about it and him not lying about it, we then get the midrash, or that is the midrash perhaps, that illuminates the idea that George Washington was a person of character. That's a midrash. I don't know if George Washington cut down the cherry tree or not. I've been to Mount Vernon. There's a lot of cherry trees left, so if he did, who would notice? But we can see how that brings the character off the page and into life. We have a lot of stories like that in Jewish tradition. Here is one. So this is a midrash that's going to bring to life why Torah is so important to the Jewish people. And we have to define Torah here a little more broadly. So though it's spelled with a capital T, here what we mean really is Torah with a small t. There's no distinction in Hebrew, obviously. But Torah here means the teaching or the law. And Torah with a small t is the whole of the canon of Jewish text, which includes, we can even say, rabbinic texts. In this context, this particular midrash is referring to the 5 books of Moses and the rest of the Tanakh, so the prophets and the writings. So think Jewish sacred text or Jewish biblical text when we talk about Torah in this context, not just the scroll. The Holy One, praised be He, I didn't write it, it's gender specific, revealed Himself, awkward, in order to give the Torah to Israel. It was not to Israel alone that He meant to give it, but He also offered it to all of the other peoples. Again, not factual, this is our folklore. First, He went to the sons of Esau and asked them, "Are you willing to accept the Torah?" And they said to Him, "What is written in it?" And He replied, "You shall not murder." But the sons of Esau said, "Sovereign of the universe, surely it was the very nature of our ancestor to be a murderer. As it is written, the hands are the hands of Esau. And it is written, by your sword you shall live. We cannot accept the Torah." So here they're using biblical quotes about Esau. Remember, Jacob and Esau are brothers, and Esau's the one of the field. Later on becomes the progenitor of Edom, of Rome, essentially, of the Roman legions. And so they say no, because murdering is part of our thing, and we can't agree to that. God then went, not so great for the Romans. God then went to the Ammonites and to the Moabites and asked them, "Are you willing to accept the Torah?" And they said to Him, "What is written in it?" And they replied, "You shall not commit adultery." You can see where this is going. But the Ammonites and the Moabites said, "Sovereign of the universe, surely it is our very nature that we are the offspring of an immoral sexual union." And it is said, "Thus the 2 daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. We cannot accept the Torah." God then went to the Ishmaelites. Remember who Ishmael was? Abraham had 2 kids, right? Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael was his first son from Hagar, his concubine. Ishmael goes on to become the progenitor of Islam. So God then went to the Ishmaelites and asked them, "Are you willing to accept the Torah?" And they said to Him, "What is written in it?" And they replied, "You cannot steal." But the Ishmaelites said, "Sovereign of the universe, surely it was the very nature of our ancestors to be a robber. As it is said, he shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. We cannot accept the Torah." Thus did the Holy One, praised be He, go from people to people, offering them the Torah, but no people was willing to accept it. At last he came to the Israelites. Without asking him what was written in the Torah, the Israelites immediately responded, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will learn to understand." Na'aseh v'nishma. In Hebrew, we'll do it, and we'll read the fine print later. The only time in history where a Jewish lawyer was not present to say that. An old joke. But so what separates, in this story, why is Torah important to the Jewish people? Why is it so central?
They were the ones that accepted it.
Because we accepted it. Nobody else wanted it. We weren't the first that were offered it. In this story, we were maybe the last, or one of the last. Everybody else quibbled. What makes the Jewish people distinct? I don't know if we would call it an attribute, but it was that we weren't so interested in what was written there. I mean, we were interested in it, but we weren't trying to set the rules of the negotiation. We just said yes, because we were so desperate, because we were so desirous of a relationship with God. You know, you could go down the list of all the reasons why people agree to things that they don't read in advance. But from that commitment comes Jewish tradition. You know, from that moment of promise, that covenant, that covenantal relationship, comes all the stuff that we're studying. So there's a folklore about why Torah is important to us, or a folk tale about why Torah is important to us, because God offered it to us. And so honored by that, we accepted it. We made the list. We got picked for the team. Even though we got picked last, we were thrilled to be on the team. So let's explain a little bit more. So turning the page, this one's from the Talmud. Again, if we're explaining what Jewish texts are, and I think we talked about this last week, you have Torah, which is the written law, and then you have Talmud, which is the oral law. Another folk tale is that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, Moses wrote down the written law during the day, and at night, while Moses slept, God whispered into Moses' ear the oral law, which becomes the Mishnah, which is the how-to manual. So if it says in Torah, sacrifice a goat, in the Mishnah it says a goat of this size, and this length, and this, that, and the next thing. And then coupled with Mishnah is the Gemara, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. So if it says sacrifice a goat in Torah, and in the Mishnah it says a goat of this size and this weight and this thing, and the Gemara would say, well, what if you can't find a goat of that size? What if your goat is sick? What if you don't have a goat? Can you sacrifice a donkey? You know, all these kinds of hypothetical questions, and there's far more questions in Talmud in Gemara than there are answers. Mishnah and Gemara, oral law, commentary on oral law, together make up Talmud. Talmud, and you have Torah. Written law, oral law. Talmud is oral law created by rabbis trying to understand or practice, like Mr. Miyagi and Karate Kid, trying to understand and practice the written law. So this comes from that oral tradition, oral law, but it begins with a proof text from the written Torah from Exodus. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their place at the foot of the mountain. Note the last 6 words of the sentence may, in the original Hebrew, also be understood as under the mountain. Rabbi, it's not even that easy in Hebrew, but Rabbi Abidim Bar Hama Bar Hassa said, like bar here means like bar mitzvah, son of. So whenever we give a Jewish name in Hebrew, it's often with an attribution towards our father. Interestingly, when you use the attribution towards your mother, it's a time of needing of healing. When do you refer to yourself by your mother's name? When you're praying for healing. All other times you're referred to by your father's name. This teaches, so the rabbi says, this teaches us that the Holy One, praise be He, lifted up the mountain over the Israelites, holding it over like an inverted barrel. He said to them, if you accept the Torah, well and good, and if not, then this will be your burial place. About this, Rabbi Aha bar Jacob offered the following comment. If this had really been so, one could protest against the Torah. After all, the Israelites had to accept it under compulsion. No, replied Rabbi Aha. In the days of King Ahasuerus, this is the story of Purim, you can hear Ed chant it in a few months, they accepted the Torah once more, but this time voluntarily. That is why it is said in the book of Esther, now we're outside of the 5 books of Moses and we're into other writings, The Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves. This means the Jews now voluntarily undertook that to which they had long before obligated themselves. What's this whole obligating themselves thing? What are we talking about here?
Well, yeah, Exodus essentially.
Right. But, so this is, did you accept the Torah? Were you at Mount Sinai? Yes.
No, but there is I guess you could call it a folk byway
Mm-hmm.
that everybody's soul was at Mount Sinai.
Right.
And if you're a convert, so you could argue yes.
Right. The 23andMe argument, right?
Yeah.
98% in Neanderthals, or 3% Neanderthal. It's not 98%.
Or the whole thing with like the wicked son and whatever, like you're supposed to say that we all left.
Right, what does this mean to me? To see yourself in the story, to see yourself in the narrative. So, and this is why what some of you are doing in this class is so profoundly inspiring to your teachers. Because where this was accepted for me by by generations before me, because I was born into it, you are standing at Sinai at this moment. You are getting this laid out in front of you in classes and a keynote presentation. And you're deciding, okay, I want this. From all the other things, from yoga and Christianity and Buddhism and all this other stuff, I want to do this. And our motivations might be relationship, and our motivations might be a host of other things. But still, you're making an informed choice. And that's what this text is trying to provide the tension of. Originally, the Jews didn't have a choice. According to the story, God held the mountain over their head and essentially said, if you don't believe in me, who's holding up the mountain? And I will bury you here. Plop goes the mountain. But then later on, Jews accepted it voluntarily. And I think that within that, within those two frames, is where every Jew lives. And you will also, once you become, if you choose to be Jewish, which is that you accept it as part of the responsibility of being a Jew, but then you accept it personally as well. Okay, this is what Jews do, and then this is my Torah. This is what I do, which in a Reform context could be, or a progressive context, somewhat different than the larger definition, but still that is a brit, that's a covenant. It's a promise that you make, a contract that you sign. That you're going to accept the responsibility. So when people say Judaism is a faith, I quibble with that. No, I don't think so. I think that Judaism is a rational exercise. It's a choice. You don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. You have to accept the concept of God for the system to work. You have to accept that there is a power greater than you that makes demands on you. But whether that power really exists, whether God is active in the world or interferes or interjects God's self, is really irrelevant. You just have to live by that system in order to be Jewish. For some, that's like, oh, I've been waiting for that my whole life. That makes sense to me for the rational. And for others, they don't want to be bothered with that part, and they're very happy to see it as an act of faith. I believe that God wrote these things and commanded these things, and therefore I do it because I believe God commanded it of me, and I believe in God. Both are fine, because both get you to the same place, which is keeping kosher, doing tzedakah, repairing the world, the myriad of commandments and mitzvot that exist within Judaism. Questions? I've shared a lot of stuff very quickly with you. Making sense?
Yeah.
Okay, just checking in. So then let's look at another text. This again comes from Midrash, just below it. Everyone according to his, again, a lot of these texts are gendered. They're gendered. I wish they weren't. Everyone according to his ability. Rabbi Yochanan said, when the voice of God came forth at Mount Sinai, it divided itself into the 70 languages of humankind, so that all peoples would be able to understand it. We're going to remember that phrase because we're going to come to it in a little bit when I go over the Torah service. Rabbi Tanchuma said, the voice of God at Mount Sinai was understood by everyone according to his ability to understand. The old people understood it according to their ability, and similarly the children and the infants and the men and the women. Note that women are included in there. Even Moses himself understood only in accordance to his own ability. That is why it says in Exodus, or it is said in Exodus, as Moses spoke, God answered him with a voice. This means with a voice that Moses was able to hear.
Bear or here?
Bear, yes. I would translate it as here also, but bear meaning that it didn't overwhelm his senses.
Yeah.
What's this text trying to teach?
Everyone has their own perspective and interpretation.
Say that louder so everybody can hear it.
Everyone has their own perspective and interpretation.
Right, and that's valid, right? So, and that changes over time. Remember we talked about how we relate differently to that story of the binding of Isaac from time to time? Your Torah as a child is Torah to you. It's not like, oh, it's training Torah and it's just got training wheels on it or whatever. That's your Torah. And as you mature, as your intellect changes, as your study deepens, your Torah becomes different. We talk about Torah being a living thing. It's not static. The text doesn't change. Again, our relationship to it, what it calls from us, what it requires of us, that changes according to our understanding and our place in life. The Torah, what I need from Torah is different as a father than it was as a single person. Certainly as a husband than it was as a single person. And I think that that's another beautiful thing. We don't have saints in Judaism. There is no expectation of perfection. There is only an expectation of growth. One of the great modern rabbis, Rabbi Abraham Tversky, teaches that the goal of Judaism is growth. That all Jews are like a blade of grass over which an angel whispers every day, grow, grow, grow. Well, all we're supposed to do is just grow every day in our knowledge, in our understanding, in our compassion, in our empathy, and to try to make progress and not to slip back. And we recognize that we slip back. That's what that whole process of tshuva is about. But Torah is for us, however it's speaking to us in that time. Questions about that one? Okay. So, a rather famous or well-known story now from the Talmud. We're on the words of the living God. Hopefully you're getting a sense of how important Torah is and why we celebrate it with the holiday of Simchat Torah. A debate between the schools of Shammai and the schools of Hillel. You'll hear these schools a lot. These are two rabbinic academies that were, I don't know what the Canadian equivalent of like the UCLA-USC game is, but these were rival schools.
SFU, UBC.
Okay, SFU, UBC, Hogwarts, something or other, I don't know. What is it? Right.
Slytherin's a house in Hogwarts.
Right, Slytherin against
I
the
said
other.
Durmstrang.
Okay. I don't know. Anyhow, they did not get along. They did not, actually that's not true. They got along, they didn't agree. Famously, it says that for as much as they disagreed, they still danced at each other's weddings and ate in each other's homes. And when there were instances when they didn't, bad things happened. Like when they allowed their intellectual disagreements to become physical disagreements, that's when divine wrath came down upon them and plagues happened and so on because they were taking it too far. But a debate between the schools of Shammai and Hillel has lasted for 3 years. These insisted that the law be decided according to their opinion, and those insisted that the law be decided according to their own opinion, or to their opinion. Finally, a heavenly voice was heard. Called this a bat kol. A bat kol would be a daughterly voice, a still small voice, a gentle voice. The opinion of these and the opinion of those are both the words of the living God. You're both right. But the law should be decided according to the opinion of the school of Hillel in this instance. But how could that have been, since both opinions were the words of the living God? Both opinions were correct. What gave the school of Hillel the right to decide the law only in accordance with their opinion? It happened because the sages of the school of Hillel were friendly and modest. They studied not only their own traditions, but also those of the school of Shammai. Indeed, they transmitted the teachings of the school of Shammai even before they transmitted their own teachings. what's this text trying to teach us? What's the value here?
The importance of seeing another perspective.
The importance of seeing another person's perspective, the importance of capturing the dissenting opinion. That's Menschlichkeit. That's good manners. That's intellectual honesty. That's citing your sources, so to speak. And that's what set them apart. It's not only that you're right, but how you be right. It's the means, not the ends. So when we celebrate Torah, or when we apply Torah in our life, we don't do it in a way that sticks a thumb in somebody's eye. I'm only right in this regard, and you're doing it wrong. That's not the Jewish way I wouldn't say that's not what Jews often do, but that's not the way that you're supposed to do it as a Jew. You're supposed to acknowledge everybody along their journey, and to acknowledge that we can come to this from different perspectives and disagree with each other. And we say that all disagreements are l'shem shamayim, they're for the sake of heaven. That if we're arguing over a text, that's a great thing. We celebrate the argument. You know the word Yisrael, you know its meaning? Did we ever talk about this? I'm going to blow your mind for a second. Who wrestles with God, right? So Yisra is to struggle, and El is another name for God. We celebrate the question. We celebrate the argument and the debate. That's where the learning comes from. And when you ignore that, when you say, "Oh, I'm the only one that thought of this, and there are no other opinions," that's not Torah. Torah is to struggle. So I often get this with Catholics who come for conversion, and they recognize or they realize that we celebrate the question. And in Catholicism, when they were growing up in catechism class, whatever it was, if they asked a question, it was a sign of a lack of faith. In Judaism, a question is a sign of faith. If you're not questioning, you're not struggling. If you're not struggling, you're not engaged. You need to struggle.
Except in the first story when the Jews are the only one who don't ask a question.
Right. Interesting point. You're right.
They got smarter with time.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, they accepted it. Remember, it says, not 7 Yishma. We'll do it, and then we'll study it. And then the studying comes the questions, but we're still going to do it. So just because you quibble with it, just because you have a question, doesn't mean you're not obligated. I might not agree, I do, but I might not agree that Jews should not eat cheeseburgers. Actually, on that one I have a quibble. So I might not agree that because, well, cheeseburgers I don't agree with. Not to screw up your Jewishness right now, but you could make an argument that poultry is not meat or not beef. And since the commandment is you shouldn't cook or boil a baby cow in its mother's milk, mixing poultry and dairy is not the same thing. Now, the reason why, I'm getting totally tangential here, but the reason why we don't do that is you could be confused thinking that your turkey burger, or thinking that your hamburger is really a turkey burger and therefore your cheeseburger is okay. But you can, as I tell my students when I cover this at camp, you can squeeze a chicken as hard as you want, you're not going to get milk out of it. You get an egg. It's not gonna... Anyway, that's an aside. I don't know why I started talking about it. Okay, so let's try to bring all of this together in one last text, or two last texts, and then we'll move on. So, we talked before about Torah at Mount Sinai, and then we're talking now about a living Torah of rabbinic Judaism of Talmud. How do we get from here to there? You heard the story that I shared with you about God whispering in Moses' ear. But Moses is gone. How do the rabbis get the authority to start interpreting laws and essentially adding on to Torah? Here, Torah with a small t. And they get it from this passage, which comes from Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is a section in the Mishnah. It's an important one. It has small, sort of pithy teachings of in English we would translate it as the ethics of our forefathers. And these are often sort of in the hierarchy of teachings. That's my wife. Talk right now. In the hierarchy of teachings, this is this is sort of the framing texts. So from the very beginning of Pirkei Avot 1:1, this is how the rabbis established their authority. At Sinai, Moses received the Torah and handed it over to Joshua, who handed it over to the elders, who handed it over to the prophets, who in turn handed it over to the men of the great assembly. The latter said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many students, and make a fence around the Torah. I want to look at those three things for a moment, and then we'll move on to the next part. Why are those values? Why are those good values? To be deliberate in judgment. We've studied now enough text that you can probably discern where that's coming from. What's it mean to be deliberate in judgment? Yeah.
Well, you don't make like rash decisions. Have a backing for the things that you say and the things that you do. Don't just do something impulsively or without regard for consequences.
Right. So Hillel and Shammai, study the alternative, study the dissenting opinion before you come to your own. So anything that we do is supposed to be informed. Judaism does not believe in blind faith. Now there's a debate in the Talmud about whether it's better to follow a commandment just because it's commanded or to follow a commandment because you agree with it. And again, Hillel and Shammai would come down on different sides of it, and in truth, up and down Oak Street, you would find different sides of that spectrum. If you go to Sharet Tzedek, the modern Orthodox synagogue, or Chabad, particularly Chabad, they would make the argument, it doesn't matter if you agree with it or not, the mitzvah is in the doing. You just do it. And that's your commandment, and that's what you do. And if you come here, we would make the argument that certainly with regard to ritual commandments, those have to make some rational sense to you. You can pick and choose a little bit of your rituals because rituals are supposed to be symbolically meaningful. Of the moral ethical, generally those are just as obligated upon progressive Jews as they are upon Orthodox Jews, with the exception of some of those moral ethical things are an affront to modern day morals and ethics. And we could go through the list. So with those, there is still a rational test. Does this conform to my sense of the gestalt of Torah? As an example, and one that's frequently used, the whole thing about homosexuality in the Torah and it being an abomination. If you read, that's one line, 2 lines. If you read the whole rest of the Torah, it's about having loving relationships, about respecting each other as being B'Tselem Elohim, as being the image of God. So is it, on a scale, you've got all of this stuff that says treat each other with respect and compassion and love, and you've got this one line that says don't, a man should not lay with another man as he would his wife, kind of thing. And you can see that in the context of the world that they lived in. You can see it in the context of the world we live in today, as being a statement written out of fear, being a statement written out of, a particular agenda perhaps. Perhaps it was agenda of procreation at the time, who knows? And the whole rest of the Torah is no, or not no. The whole rest of the Torah is don't discriminate in that way. So with many within our community, that's where they land. But you have to be discerning in your study of the text. You have to grapple with it, and it is. We read this on Yom Kippur, that nothing in the Torah is too hard for you to understand. Remember the text we read before. Everything was given in a language of our own understanding. There's nothing in there that we can't, that doesn't compute. It's all there. There's no mystery. It's not hidden stuff that only the rabbis know. It's all accessible. It just might require more study. So what about the second one? Raise up many disciples. I keep seeing the same hands. New hands.
Provide subject matter experts.
Okay, why? Why is it important?
We need to have those that are most educated in the topic able to answer the questions of those who aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to spread knowledge and spread understanding.
So I think it's that second part that's even most important, to spread the knowledge. It can't die with a generation. So we go back to the wicked son, we go back to Pesach. Pesach's the perfect frame. Passover is the perfect frame. That whole evening is about teaching it not to the grown-ups. You learn in order to teach, right? So the whole point of that is to teach it to the next generation so they can teach it to the next generation. We call that Jewish continuity. We call it the door by door, from generation to generation. You have a responsibility to make sure that it doesn't die with you. By the way, if you have run into some tension with your Jewish partner, spouse-to-be's family about them dating a non-Jewish person or being engaged to a non-Jewish person, Some of it comes from that. It doesn't, some of it, not even some, much of it comes from this Jewish fear of disappearing. You know, and in every generation something renews that, whether it's anti-Semitism or the Holocaust or pogroms or whatever it is. It's hard enough to be Jewish, and now you're going to go marry out. They should be celebrating you and lauding you for being here, because you're taking this step. Whether it results in conversion or not is a whole other story. But you're taking this step, and many of you are committing to, if you should have children, to raise them as Jews. But that's where the fear is coming from, that we're going to lose people, that we're not going to be able to pass this on. I don't think there's a lot of religions that come from that place. I mean, in my experience, Catholics, Christians in general, are not worried about it disappearing off the face of the earth. The few, and I have a few, but only a few Muslim friends I have, are not worried about it disappearing off the face of the earth. Jews think about that all the time. In fact, there was a famous essay written, Judaism, the Ever-Dying People. And sometimes we draw on that survival narrative as a motivation. Some rabbis of a particular era, that was their sermon. You know, they tried to kill us, and so we have to survive, you know, just to prove them wrong. You know, it's a sermon that works. I think it's a little shallow for the world we live in today, but it got us through a lot of difficult times. That's a reason in itself.
I mean, I just wanted to say, like,
Yeah.
I was born as a Catholic in my family, but some part of my family is Orthodox. And I know when my aunt was getting married, like, it was everything fine as long as you marry Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she found her husband was Orthodox. Same Christian religion, different path. My grandparents were horrified.
Mm.
And they were horrified, actually. They didn't know in what direction their children, their grandchildren will go.
Mm-hmm.
She was afraid, like, oh my God, like, if my children go to the Orthodox, they will lose. In a family, it would be a big loss for the family.
Right.
So that was most of the concern. Like, you know, I think for the Catholics I grew with, like, let's keep it in a family. So that let's not dilute family.
No, and it makes sense. I mean, I think there's a tribalism to that.
Yeah.
But it wasn't existential. They're not talking about existential.
No,
acts.
not existential, but it's a loss of the family. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, if they would decide to baptize kids in an Orthodox, it would be like kind of a
Right, there's a loss of status, there's a loss of, you know, purity,
of,
so to
yeah.
speak, yes, right.
So,
But as you say, Camille, it's not an existential threat.
Yeah, it's not existential.
The
Yes.
thing is too, it's because as Jews, it's been an existential threat since essentially the destruction of the Second Temple.
Mm-hmm.
It's genetically part of, probably physically in
Right.
our genetics, but also, you know, it's become who we are.
Right.
That survival and that existential constant threat is part of the religion now.
Right. No, I mean, studies show that trauma is passed on from generation to generation. So we have we have a historical trauma that, you know, that sort of gets rewounded every 100 years or so, and I think it's genetically coded at this point
changes
in
your
the Jewish
DNA.
people. It does. It changes your DNA for sure. Studies have shown that. You know, and that's so. I mean, now we're getting a little bit far afield, but that's one of the challenges that Jews living in the diaspora have. So by diaspora, let's just speak North America for a moment. When Jews are not pressed and they can live as Jews or not live as Jews and nobody cares, that's where we get assimilation. It's the pressure of being told that you're the other that often is the thing that sort of keeps the Jewish community together. It's interesting for me, coming from Los Angeles to Vancouver, where in LA all the schools are closed on Jewish holidays because there's all the teachers and many of the students are Jewish, not all the teachers, but you know, so many of the student population are Jewish that they can't afford to run it. You know, kosher restaurants are everywhere, and there is a sense that, I mean, sort of Yiddishkeit and, you know, sort of Hebrew slang is just kind of in the air. You know, you have Hollywood moguls talking about chutzpah and stuff like that. I don't experience that in Vancouver, and neither do my children. And so my kids go to public school, and the holidays, you know, there were big things that were happening in their classes. They were getting their classes. There was a field trip during Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and they had to make, it wasn't much of a choice, they didn't have a choice, but, but they had to accept some of the consequences of being Jewish. And sometimes they will say to me, because they know it gets me, I hate being Jewish. And sometimes I do too. But it's defining. I grew up going to public school also, and if you have other Jews in this room, they might have the same memory. I have a distinct memory of going to school during Passover and pulling out my matzah and tuna fish sandwich and having somebody ask me, why are you eating that cracker? And then me, as a 7-year-old, having to explain what Passover is to them as I understood it as a 7-year-old. I still remember that today, not because I'm a rabbi, because that was a moment when I understood, to be Jewish is different. Now, some will run away from that differentness, and for others, it's a badge of honor and distinction. And it happens time and time again. We have a congregant who works in the government, and he wears a yarmulke to work every day. And he works in the accounting part of the government, and he gets some flack for that from people. People make comments, Jews and money and the whole thing. And I think it has made him a stronger, he tells me, it has made his Jewish identity more robust as it confronts that. So there's a yin and a yang to it. There are some positives, and at the same time, without it, can you still find a reason to be Jewish? And that's my challenge as a rabbi, because I don't like to hit the survival button all the time, ever, except for when necessary, perhaps. And so I want us to find reasons to be Jewish that don't have to do with I got to stay alive because they tried to kill my grandparents. It's got to be more than that, in my view. Okay, I didn't get to any of the stuff on the slideshow I was going to do, but that's okay. I really wasn't sure where this class was going to go. It was such a small topic that I threw a bunch of stuff at it. Let's look at this one. Look at page 23 or 297. It looks like this. It's 1 or 2 pages past where we were. Chapter 27, it says at the top of the page. Metzuda Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law. You don't have that? Oh. Didn't copy. Okay. Skip that. Yeah, I'll do the slides. Okay. So, we're not going to get to all of these, and I couldn't get the remote to work. Okay. So, what I wanted to do was talk about the Torah service as a frame for understanding Simchat Torah. Because really, every week is Simchat Torah. Every Shabbat, or every Torah reading, you'll see in a moment that we read Torah on more than just Saturday, is a celebration of the Torah. We have this special service that exists within the frame of all the regular prayers that's like an extra ceremony just for the taking out of this scroll. Why? And I think we have a little understanding of why, but how. So I wanted to start here, which is, this is Rav Kook. He was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel. When we pray, we take that which is us, that which is in us, and reach up. When we study Torah, we take the light from above and plant it in our deepest nature. So, where does prayer begin and end according to Rav Kook?
With us.
Right, it begins within us and it ends there in God. I would quibble with Rav Kook. I'm not sure he would appreciate that. But I would say that prayer is actually a boomerang and that we send it out and it comes back to us. We're not, and the metaphor I would use is if you, and it's not my metaphor, but if you see a person in a rowboat and there's a rope going to the shore and they're pulling on the rowboat, or they're pulling on the rope, they're not pulling the shore to them. They are pulling themselves to the shore. Prayer is the rope. We are pulling ourselves closer to meaning. When we pray, it's not for God, it's for us. But we have to send it out in order to receive it back. But really, it's the second part here. Where does Torah learning begin and end?
From above and into your soul.
Right, Torah descends. And the Kabbalists have all sorts of metaphors for this, like dewdrops of rain. That Torah is in the ether, and we have to gather it. The metaphor would be manna from heaven that we talk about in the Bible, how it's just fallen, but we have to be the ones that gather. Torah is in the world, There was Torah in your day today. I don't know what you did in your offices or your studies or your relationships, but there was Torah in that moment. Did you extract the Torah from it? Remember, we began our class by talking about, did you see the world through a Jewish lens? Can you find the Torah? Can you find the Jewish values, the Jewish imperatives in your interactions? When I talk with our congregation and people say, oh, we don't have that many people at services. We actually do. We have a nice crowd. But, oh, I don't come to services very often, people often say. I will remind them two things. One, I don't take attendance. I don't notice when they're not there, only when they are. Attendance is to notice who's not there. I notice when they are. But more than that it's it's about, and I said this before, it's about how Torah shows up in your life. That's the real measure. So it's not about whether you come to synagogue. That's not really a particularly Jewish metric. Prayer is only one of the measures. But do you vote Jewishly? Do you give charity Jewishly? Do you treat your spouse, your children, your relationships Jewishly? And by that I mean the good Jewish stuff, not the misogynistic stuff that we get to. So that's out in the world, and you have to collect it. You're doing that now. We collect it through study. So why do we celebrate the Torah? Because it's like the scattering of seeds. When we take the Torah scroll out and we start to read it, manna is dropping from heaven. Seeds are being planted, and we're gathering them up. It's coming at us, not from us. I think it's a beautiful image. Okay, so this is Ezra the scribe. I'm not sure that's exactly what he looked like. But, and I can't read either of these.
What are some similarities?
Right. Well, I was going to describe the Torah service. These are just sort of framing questions. So you've been to synagogue, I think most of you. The Torah service has a lot of pomp and circumstance. It's connected to a historical moment when Ezra the scribe, now we're talking 516 BCE, before the Common Era. The temple was destroyed in 586. 70 years later, the Jews return. And when they return, they rebuild the temple, but more than rebuilding the temple, they have to rebuild the religion. And what do they start to do there? They take this oral tradition. What they did when they were in Babylon in exiles, they started to write it down. Because they were worried that if they weren't around the table together, they would lose it. They would be scattered to the winds, and where would the story go? So they started to write it down. It's attributed to Ezra. It's written actually by multiple people, but attributed to Ezra. And Ezra would then gather everybody on Mondays and Thursdays, which were the market days. And he would gather everyone together and he would read the Torah, just like we do today. And it says in the text, and I don't think I bring it here, maybe I do. Yeah. Ezra chose the busiest time of the week in the public square in Jerusalem that he could find, and he also chose to read Torah not only on Shabbat, but on Mondays and Thursdays. You might ask, but why Mondays and Thursdays? Go ahead and ask. He chose those days because they were market days. These were the days the square was busiest because everyone would come out to buy and to sell. I thought I had the quote in here. Maybe I don't. Okay. And in the quote, he says that he read, it says in his own book, that he read it in the language that they could understand. He read and translated, and that men and women and the stranger in their midst all heard the story. It was a very ecumenical, broad, accessible teaching. So we do that now. We read Torah on Mondays at the synagogue. We don't have a minyan on Thursdays, but in other synagogues they read Torah on Thursday mornings, Monday mornings, and then Saturday mornings, and of course holidays. In some congregations they will take that slice of pizza and they will break it into 3 bites. So over the course of the week they'll read the entire parsha, the entire slice. In our congregation we just take a bite of the slice. We don't read the entire text. In other congregations, they'll break it over 3 years. They'll do something called a triennial cycle. So they'll read the entire thing, but it'll take them 3 years to get to it, and they'll read it in a triennial cycle. So they're still the same parsha, but they do it over 3 years. however it is, we have this great pomp and circumstance for the bringing out of the Torah and the reading. So just as other parts of the worship service have different themes and prayers, the Torah service also has its own special drama and choreography. Here are the basic sections of that, of their contents. So in your prayer book, you can turn to page 363. And you'll find there something called Seder Kriyat Torah, the service for the reading of Torah. Did I get the page right? 362, 362. Pretty good for not having looked it up. I just have to turn this a little bit. I can't see that. So we begin with opening psalms and songs. Like anything else, if you're going to have a ceremony, you got to begin with music. So the Torah service has its own soundtrack. It's different than the rest of the prayers. It's usually more flourish to it. We rise at this moment, so we change our position. We rise in reverence, and a whole bunch of things start happening. People start moving around. In many congregations, there are honors that are attributed to this moment. So you might be asked, even as not yet a Jew, by the people that help us run the service, the Gabayim, the assistants to the rabbis, if you would, and cantor, to open the doors of the ark, or to hold the Torah. This you would need to be Jewish to do at this point in our congregation, but there's all these other ways to include people in this moment, so that it has this sense of ceremony. So we say these opening words, and then we take the Torah from the ark. I can see this, and then we pronounce the Shema. Now we've already said the Shema in the service, but we're doing it here at this moment for yet another proclamation of Jewish faith and the oneness or the unity of God. And it has another second line to it, or a different second line, where I don't want to get into all the details of prayer. Naomi will do that, but it has a different second line that's also a little more proclamative. That's a word. So then, just like on the Simchat Torah, we're going to parade around with the Torah. We do this so that we're not distant from Torah. It's not way over there, hidden in the ark, only things that the rabbis touch. We bring it out into the people. That's where Torah should be. And as it goes through the congregation, you'll see people bow to the Torah. You'll see people kiss the Torah. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that moment. My grandmother, Vera Kipnis, who was about this tall, and a socialist to her dying day, from Augusta, Georgia, and one of my great heroes, and a Jewish teacher, she would never kiss the Torah because she didn't want to be accused of idolatry. She would bow to the Torah, but she wouldn't kiss the Torah. So I don't kiss the Torah either because grandma didn't kiss the Torah. But we treat the Torah as though it were a teacher. So it's not that it has special powers. We have special obligations towards it in terms of how we treat it, but it's not an idol. But we admire its teaching. And by the way, that gets to the last part of that previous text that I didn't cover from Pirkei Avot, the setting a fence around the Torah. Again, we want to make something sacred, you have to separate it and elevate it. So this is not a regular book. This is not the John Grisham novel that we just finished. This is something different. And so we treat it with different respect, and we acknowledge its presence in the room as a source of learning. So congregants, and you won't kiss it, well, I wouldn't say won't. Different communities have different customs. The Sephardic tradition is to actually put your lips to the Torah. That's why in some Sephardic communities you'll see lipstick marks. Well, not so many because they don't take it over to the women's side. Maybe you'd see lipstick marks on men's side. I don't know. But there's a lipstick mark on one of our scrolls, the cover right now from the high holidays. Gotta get it clean. But so some people will kiss the Torah, but generally you would take your prayer book, you would touch that to the Torah, and then you would kiss that. You don't kiss it and then put your kiss on, because then you're going to get the lipstick on the Torah or whatever it is. Touch the Torah, kiss the book. You might take your talit and do that. We try to create a little bit of a separation. Again, this is about making things holy. So the Torah is paraded around, and then we prepare for the Torah reading. Was there a question?
It can wait.
No, that's fine.
Because there was also just the prayer shawl for me is just such a beautiful thing to witness.
Yeah.
And it was really, really cool the first time that I ever saw that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's wrapped around people.
Right.
And this first time I came here, actually, I had one person with a prayer shawl here, and then another couple here, and I was, sort of draped by these two.
Nice.
It was really, really, really lovely. And then in the service, there was also a tent that was made to cover the kids.
Right, the
So
hoop over the
maybe you
kids.
could sort of talk a little bit about
Yeah.
the symbolism of that as well.
I'll do it just briefly because we'll cover it in another section. I call that prayer wear. So the talit has fringes on it. The garment itself, the cloth, has no special significance other than it says in the book of Numbers that you should put a fringe on the corner of your garments. And the fringe or the tassel, it's called a tzitzit, is there to remind you of the commandments. I'll get to how they remind you in a moment. Most of our garments don't have corners on them anymore, so we wear a talit in order to have a garment that has corners so you can put the fringe on it. You'll see Orthodox Jews that have tzitzit hanging out the corners of or the bottoms of their shirts. They're wearing, and I'll bring this when I teach this, an undershirt that has 4 corners on it so that they can fulfill this commandment. The fringes themselves represent all of the mitzvot, all 613 commandments, and if you were to add up all the knots and the twists and the turns and count them up, it equals 613 on each fringe. So in some way, they become kind of like Jewish prayer beads, or the idea that you wrap a string around your finger to not forget something. Very briefly, in the story in the book of Numbers where it comes from, a man goes out to cut down a tree on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to cut down a tree on the Sabbath. And so in the very next line, God commands, after they killed a man for doing it, very biblical, God commands that you should put a fringe on the corner of your garment so you don't forget the commandments. The thinking being the next time you go to reach for your axe, oh, what are these strings? Oh yeah, didn't do that. Back to synagogue. So that's where it comes from. Yes?
Did they kill him on the Sabbath?
That's a great question. I don't think so.
Okay.
But I don't know.
Because then you have like a recurring.
Right. That's an interesting idea. I don't think they did. I think it happened after the Sabbath. So we prepare for the reading of Torah. We prepare for the reading of Torah, and we do this by usually giving a summary of the Torah portion. You'll hear the bar mitzvah kids particularly do it. Sometimes the rabbi, sometimes the gabbai if there's not a bar mitzvah. And this is so because people might not remember where we are. They didn't check the app. Or even if we say it's Parshat Lech Lecha, which is this week's Torah portion, they might not remember what that story is about. So we give a summary so that you have a sense of it. And then most people will, or many, I won't say most, will take the Chumash, which is not the prayer book, but the other book that we often use in synagogue, which is the translation of the Torah, with its commentary, and they'll follow along with the reading. Yes?
Just want to let you know it's after 9:30.
Oh, I couldn't see. Okay, I'm going to stop here with just this last thing. So they'll follow along with the reading, and in doing that, thank you for stopping me. In doing that, it's our obligation to not just sit there and let somebody else read it. We're supposed to read Torah too. So if it's in Hebrew, it's not just there to listen to. It's not just a background music, but we're supposed to understand what's going on. You could make a really strong argument that Torah should be read in English in this congregation. I haven't yet made that argument. Maybe after I've been here for 25 years. There's beauty in the chanting, and I wouldn't want to lose that. And at the same time, what are we doing if we don't understand what we're doing? So, and it adds a lot of time if you do the Hebrew and the English. Somewhere there's a technology that's going to solve this for us, whether it's projecting the words above the Torah as we read. I don't know, but we need to solve that, otherwise it's going to become irrelevant.
Google's designing some Babel.
Right, right. So we'll work on that. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for indulging me tonight, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.